Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kay Jacobson, the History Coordinator of Ramsey County Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the popular ongoing presidential series by historian J.B. Andersen. Today's talk is the last in the series focusing on James Madison, our fourth president. Today's program has been brought to you through Ramsey County Libraries with our co-sponsorship with Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. We're deeply grateful for this cooperation. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our speaker, J.B. Andersen.
Good. We are ready to go. A clarification. Last week I said one thing that was accurate, and then later on got thoroughly confused about it. That happens regularly, so I can't panic about it. Anyhow, Dolley Madison and the Van Buren administration, we were talking about her being First Lady for 20 years. 8 years under Jefferson, 8 years under her husband, and then sharing the duties with another woman during the Van Buren administration. This is Van Buren's wife, Hannah. Her maiden name was Hose, so it's Hannah Hose Van Buren. She lived to be 35 years, dying in 1819 of tuberculosis. And he was president in 1837 to 1841, so she had been dead for 18 years. Sharing duties with Dolley Madison was Dolley Madison's niece, Angela Singleton, who married Van Buren's son. This is a picture of Angela Singleton Van Buren. Another picture of her paintings, actually. She served as First Lady again during the Van Buren administration. I thought it might also be interesting. You see what's behind me. Here's what I see looking forward while I'm speaking to you. So I thought it might be interesting to show it to you. This is my computer. I have a monitor here. Here's my mouse. Sits down here, and the keyboard. And I didn't get them put in here. I just took this picture, but I have a beverage over here, and I have a my cell phone, because I can tap on that occasionally and see what time it is, how much time I have left. I have a brother who's an artist. This is a self-portrait of his. These miniatures I purchased from a woman in Stillwater. I have several of them in other parts of the house. This is Mark Twain. This is my Nerd Perfect sign. And these hippos I purchased from a woman in Wisconsin, River Falls. She's married a guy in Texas, so she now lives in Texas. I also have some chimpanzees by her that are this same sort of, they're an inch thick pottery items, and I have a frog that's sitting on a large chunk of a kind of a water lily sitting on it. Anyhow, this is what I see. I have a fan in case it gets warm. I used it once and it really screwed up the sound, so I can't use it when I'm online. So anyhow, that's my life. I have a bookcase over here. These are genealogy things that I wrote up over a 5-year period. I got about 3,000 pages. This continues way on. And there's books there and so on. Anyhow, this is what I look at while I'm speaking, so in part. I also have a sign like this. I had it on my front door, but took it down. Then I had it up here in my office. I took it down. It's just laying around I'm gonna find a place for it, maybe. We'll see. Anyhow, back to Madison, finally. We are talking about the War of 1812. We were talking about 3 theaters of war. And today we're talking about the Great Lakes and the southern part. Now, what we talked about last week in the 3 theaters of war were the Atlantic Ocean, which the United States didn't want to fight in because the British had such a gigantic navy compared to the United States. And the ports were all blockaded and closed anyway. Nothing could be accomplished. Then the Great Lakes area, we talked about. The United States moved the war there because it'd be a land-based war, and it would be with Canada, Canadian troops, as well as British troops. Canada wasn't a nation yet, not till 1867. And then the South. And that's what we're talking about today now, is this 3rd theater of war, the South. The big item here was a person, Andrew Jackson, became a national hero fighting British in the South. However, much of what this war was about in the South really was Native Americans, not British. Jackson had several famous battles with Native Americans. The worry was that the Native Americans were siding with the British because the Native Americans were having land taken from them. They were suffering with lots of injuries and deaths in wars with the United States. So, of course, they would like to side with Great Britain, who they felt would treat them much better. This graphic here is Horseshoe Bend, which was one of the major battles that Jackson was involved with. It's in present-day Alabama in the center of the state, and it was in 1814, and the U.S. under Jackson won this battle. Compare it, I like to compare things to today. Alabama has been heavy in politics. Donald Trump, you might remember, called the Secretary of State in Alabama after the 2020 election, who was a fellow Republican, and asked him to find 11,700 more votes so he could win that state and win the election. Also in 2024 now, the state of Alabama, where this Battle of Horseshoe Bend occurred, has declared that frozen embryos are people. One of Jackson's lieutenants was the man who became very famous, Sam Houston, who in the 1830s, now this 25 years later, managed to get the territory of Texas seceded from Mexico. And of course, Houston, Texas is named for him. In 1845, about 10 years after Texas became independent from Mexico, it became a state. Jackson was on the north side of this Horseshoe Bend. General John Coffee, who's pictured here, was stationed south of the bend. So you had Native Americans basically facing U.S. forces from the south of Horseshoe Bend and from the north of it. Another major battle in this area was the Battle of New Orleans, which involved Jackson. And Jackson met with this man who was a pirate or a privateer. His name was John Lafitte. Now, a pirate is somebody operating alone under their own authority. A privateer is basically a pirate, but they have been given authority by a government to operate. So the pirate operating alone becomes a privateer with the interests of a country, some nation in mind. And here's John Lafitte. Lafitte and Jackson met at this still existing bar known as the Old Absinthe House in New Orleans. I have been there and went into this place. I didn't have a drink, but I wish I'd have spent more time now. And you can see here's a picture of it back after photography was invented in the late 1830s. Here's a picture of it today, the exterior. You can sit outside. Yeah, right across the street from it is the St. Louis Cathedral, which is gigantic. This really isn't a street. It's kind of an alleyway. It's really narrow. You walk along it. There's lots of shops, and I bought a aftershave at one of these shops, and there was all sorts of other things you could buy. So interesting place. Spent I think it was a week in the French Quarter. Never left the French Quarter. There's just tons of stuff to do there. So the Battle of New Orleans actually took place south of New Orleans at the Calumet battlefield. When I was there, I got on board a boat. My wife was with me, and we took this boat south down to the Calumet battlefield. And it was kind of interesting going at 10 miles or so. The guy that was navigating us was giving us guides. He'd say, on the left is the Sally Mae, a ship that sunk in 1954. And there were several of these things. And I thought, holy mackerel, if this was in Minnesota, they'd be fining them $10,000 a day for not getting their trash out of the river. Anyway, Calumet battlefield, interesting place. The U.S. won the war, gigantically won it. British losses numbered around 2,000, U.S. losses at about 100. And unfortunately, it was fought 3 weeks after the treaty ending the war was signed. But news didn't travel very fast in these days. The treaty was negotiated and signed in Europe, and it took several weeks, 4 to 6 weeks to cross the ocean. So this is just 3 weeks after the signing of the treaty. Nobody in the United States knows about it yet. This is a picture of Crawdad Hole on the Calumet battlefield. It's a very wet area. It's a wetland, and it's just it's got lots of these crawdad holes. You walk along in this battlefield and you see water squirting up through this hole here in the middle. That's crawdad spitting out the water. And anyhow, interesting place. War of 1812. Let's take a look at weapons. There were rifles. Rifles were a little bit better than muskets, or a little bit worse than muskets, depending on your attitude. But of course, rifles became much better, but there wasn't much of a difference between a rifle and a musket during the War of 1812. Then you had, other weapons that would be poked at you, and they included swords, pikes, knives, bayonets. There were cannons. They would fire a cannonball, but they were not yet explosive. The cannonball would simply rip through things, defenses, or people's bodies. And eventually, of course, explosive materials were placed inside these, the cannon balls. And of course, they did far more damage then. And musket balls were round at this time. We're going to talk about different shapes. A musket had a smooth bore on it. Look at this. See, this has got grooves cut in it. Well, a musket was just round, so it would come shooting out of the barrel. Accuracy was pretty bad, but if you could get that ball spinning, the accuracy was much better because it would remain on course better. Rifles also had round balls and these cylindrical grooves, but at this time were still hand loaded. Took about 20 seconds to load a musket and get it fired. So you could do that 3 times in a minute almost if you were really good at it. The rifles with this kind of grooving took about 3 minutes to load, and the reason was you were still using a round ball and it had to go down the barrel of the rifle. And it was difficult for it to go down the barrel of a rifle because of these grooves. So pushing it in was far more difficult than on a musket, where this rifling, as it's called, didn't exist. You know, the muskets were smooth bore here in the middle, so they could operate much fast. So greater accuracy. Now, they didn't have this elongated shell yet. They had a round ball. But here you can see with rifling, there's a lot of twist. Without rifling, it's just like down here, bang, out it comes and wobbles a lot more, has a lot more difficulty. So spinning the bullet really keeps it on target. Accurate for several hundred yards with rifling in it as opposed to smoothbore items. Accuracy distance varied. Musket was probably good for about 50 yards. A rifle was much longer, but it depended on the number of twists that were built into the barrel. So here are some examples. Here's just like a single twist. Here you get a double twist. Here's a triple twist. The more twisting that you get, the more accurate the weapon is. Both muskets and rifles during the War of 1812 were hand-loaded. You had to put powder in them. That was loaded down by the trigger, as you see here in the graphic. Then you put a ball in, and that went in at the end of the item. And then you had to pack it in place also. Today's controversy about these weapons. 1808, we had round bullets. You'd pack the round ball in, and then you'd pack gunpowder in with it. And eventually invented in 1808 was the ball and the gunpowder were wrapped in paper so they could be inserted as a single item into the barrel, which was very helpful. It wasn't until 1826, this is 11 years after the end of the War of 1812, that the cylinder bullet with a head, here's the head of it here, and then this base down here has gunpowder in it. So you could just load that very quickly in the gun and fire it. Not available during the War of 1812. Interesting controversy surrounds the invention of the rifle too, and that's it's 35 years after the Second Amendment. When the Second Amendment was written, all that existed were muskets. So does this apply to the Second Amendment as a weapon that can be used or not? Conservatives have argued that we have to look at the Constitution and its original content. What was the intent of the founding fathers? All they knew was a musket. So does a rifle apply to the Second Amendment? Does a pistol apply? A six-shooter, things like that? Weapons. Let's take a look at British soldier armaments. The British soldiers had a musket that they applied the name Brown Bess to, because it was wood mostly, except for the middle area where the ball would be inserted. But back at your shoulder and all the way up, encasing the metal area was wood, so it was a brown color. So they called it a brown Bess. All these muskets were pretty inadequate, especially the brown Bess by the British. Its major problem was the complexity of loading it. It took 18 steps. We're not going to go through all of them, but here they are. I mean, it begins with reach in your cartridge box, get a leather casing, and it ends with fire the musket. But look at all these steps. 18 steps you have to go through before you can fire one of these British Brown Bess rifles. Each soldier also had a bayonet. They had a bag that held 60 rounds of ammunition, so they could reach in that bag and fire 60 rounds, and then they'd have to go get another bag someplace. I could not find a bayonet from the War of 1812. This is an 1842 model, which is very similar, at least according to the description. So the second major thing you could do is attach this bayonet to your rifle, or you could use it in your hand if necessary. And it was used if you ran out of ammunition to be fired by the rifle. You could then use the bayonet as a kind of a pike. Soldier armament, United States soldier armament. U.S. soldiers used mostly foreign weapons. The United States was not a gigantic weapon manufacturer. We'd been buying weapons like the Brown Bess from the British. We'd also been buying muskets from the French, and then we also had muskets that were made in the U.S. This becomes very difficult in warfare. I mean, you got a bunch of troops and they got 3 different pieces of equipment from the French, the British, and the U.S., and sometimes even more than that, because there might be a local musket maker someplace, and you bought your musket from him and then took it with you to the war. So the government can't just hand out ammunition to you. It doesn't fit all this stuff. It wasn't until the Civil War that we actually got weaponry so that it was the same for every soldier. Consequently, what you were firing could be the same also. So the French and U.S. weapons were much easier to use than was the British Brown Bess. It was easier to clean. It was lighter in weight, these French and U.S. muskets. Soldiers also had a bayonet or a pike, as pictured here. It's a long stick with a metal tip on the end of it. Also, the rifles that finally had a cylinder type bullet that had gunpowder loaded in the base of it, and then the head of it was a cylindrical, as opposed to a round ball that was the projectile. So many soldiers had a spear, a pike, as well as a bayonet. The Treaty of Ghent. This is the treaty that ended the War of 1812 in 1815. It was a city here in Netherlands. Here's Netherlands. Today, Ghent is located in Belgium, but the border for the Netherlands came south here like this. So it was a city in Netherlands, and the Treaty of 1812 was signed there. It's negotiated and signed in Ghent. During the War of 1812, England had gained from Canada, so in the north, a total of 10 million acres, most of it around Lake Superior in the Michigan area and in the Maine area. And here I've surrounded these areas. The United States was fighting the British, especially over here in the West, gained a lot of territory south of Lake Superior within Michigan. Of course, Canada, look how Canada comes way down here in Michigan. And around Maine, they had also captured a great deal of land. This is gigantic, 10 million acres. War continued during the peace negotiations. Sometimes it would be announced, okay, we're going to the peace table, and everybody would sit tight and wait to find out if an agreement was reached or not. That did not happen in the War of 1812 with James Madison as president. One of the reasons was the U.S. was winning battles. We didn't want to stop. And the fact that the United States was winning these battles against Britain, that's a great bargaining point when you sit down at a peace table. So Madison's able to say, keep reminding them we're winning battles. Keep reminding them that, no, we're not willing to do what you say here. We're kind of in charge. Three treaty provisions, three major treaty provisions, and there were some things that weren't provisions that are quite shocking that we'll talk about also. So number one, all territory conquered by Britain has to be returned to the United States. So that 10 million acres conquered around the Great Lakes and over in Maine, that land, that all has to be returned to the United States. Second treaty provision, the United States wanted fishing rights in Canadian, meaning British territory, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Let's take a look at the bigger image here. Here's Nova Scotia. And here's New Brunswick. Here's Newfoundland over here. Here's the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's a kind of an inland sea associated with the Atlantic Ocean, rich with fish. So the United States wanted to fish there. So a part of the treaty provision, which really had nothing to do with the war, it's just, hey, we want to fish in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the U.S. says. They're in a position to win some points due to the fact that they're winning battles. So the United States gained fishing rights in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And boundaries between the U.S. and Canada have to be returned to their 1812 positions. This again solidifies the return of the 10 million acres that the British had won in the north. There were lots of disagreements about the Maine border, however. Look at this border. 611-mile border is the border between Maine and Canada. So it's a gigantic amount of border. So there are lots of issues about where is the border, and that didn't get resolved for a while. There's a long border between the U.S. and Canada, a total of 5,525 miles. So we're lucky that that's a neighbor who generally we've been at peace with, because that is a gigantic border throughout the world. That's between all nations. That's a very big border between Canada and the U.S. It wasn't until 1842 in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty that this border was finally solidified between Maine and Canada. So 30 years later, almost 30 years after the beginning of the War of 1812 anyway. Items that were not accomplished by this treaty was the impressment of sailors. The British would lose some sailors. They might have a battle with a French ship, and they became concerned about the loss of 4 crew members. So they'd pull over a private American ship owned by a corporation in the United States that was trading with Mediterranean nations in particular. They'd pull it over and say, "We need 4 of your sailors," and that's impressment. The United States called it kidnapping. So the impressment of sailors was never dealt with. The practice continued after the War of 1812. Also, the United States ports had been blockaded. Stuff could not get out the ships, all these private company ships that were trading with Europe and Southern Europe and the Mediterranean and Northern Africa and the Mediterranean, all that trade that was going on was blockaded. Well, we never dealt with the blockade. And of course, the British wanted us trading only with them. These were the 2 main items that led to the War of 1812, and amazingly, were not dealt with in the treaty. Items that stayed the same: areas conquered by, or areas that the U.S. had conquered from Spain remained in U.S. hands. Spain controlled Florida. Now, we had Andrew Jackson battling Native Americans here in the South because they were siding with the British, or at least that was the excuse we gave. And Jackson and his underling generals conquered, look over here on the right, they conquered this Mobile, Alabama area today, and this panhandle of Florida was conquered from the Spanish who controlled Florida. And those conquests in the South stayed with the United States. Spain wasn't involved in this treaty. All other items were to remain as they had been in 1812, the status quo. No territorial changes are to be made. That was the agreement between the British and the U.S. War of 1812, after effects. There were 12 after effects, excuse me. And we're going to talk about each one of them. So this is a bit of a lengthy section. Number 1, justification for the war. Canada and Britain operating together, of course, Britain really controlled Canada, saw the war as, we're defending our territory. The United States wants to take over much of Canada. And we want to keep the United States out of Canada. We want to maintain the present border. The United States saw the war as Andrew Jackson winning great fame, Battle of New Orleans. His removal of Native Americans also opened up lots of land for white settlers, European settlers coming to the United States. So the South was getting more land, land that had belonged to Native Americans. This ended up benefiting farmers coming into the area because they could grow cotton now on that native land. The famous Trail of Tears occurred during this time, and it was Andrew Jackson rounding up Cherokee Indians in Georgia and forcibly transporting them to Oklahoma. About 4,000 died en route. Of course, what's interesting about it is Native Americans were basically given Oklahoma as a place, okay, you can live there. And they were given Oklahoma because the land isn't very good there, can't grow much, etc. Eventually, oil is discovered there. The Cherokee Indians become a very wealthy group of Native Americans in this day, even due to the discovery of oil. in Oklahoma. Cost of the war is the next two of the 12 things we'll be talking about. In 1815 dollars, it was $105 million to fight the war against Britain. By inflation only. So this is calculated by inflation. $2.1 billion in 2023 money. The war against Iraq in 2004 cost about $7.4 million per hour. In 28 days, it would have paid the 3-year cost of the entire War of 1812. If you made $1 million in your entire working life, I think I made about $1.2 million during my working life. It would have paid for about 8 minutes of the war against Iraq. A third of the 12 items concerning the War of 1812 was national debt. The national debt due to the war increased from $45 million in 1812 to $127 million in 1815, so a threefold increase. That's about $2.8 billion in 2023. The debt in 2023 was $31.5 trillion. This was $2.8 billion, a fraction of that. Of the national debt, $7.8 trillion of it occurred during the Trump administration. Amazingly, the Republican Party, which is opposed to national debt, Trump alone during a 4-year period was responsible for almost 25% of the total national debt. Many people blame social programs. The reality is it's debt from wars, it's debt from a huge military budget, and it's debt from corporate bailouts. Now, these are not opinions of mine. These are facts. Here's corporate bailouts. We've talked about this in the past. There are a total in 2020, $263 billion worth of corporate bailouts. Here are the top 10 corporate bailouts. An insurance company got 68 billion. You can see most of them are banks in the top 10. 4 of 12 items. This is war support. Many claim that the United States citizens did not support wars the way they did in the past. So here we are in the 21st century. We're not supporting our wars like we did in the past. Simply not true. During the American Revolution, about a third of all U.S. residents remained loyal to Britain. About a third didn't care, and about a third were interested in independence. This business today of people not supporting wars, well, there were lots of people not supporting wars during the American Revolution and during the War of 1812 also. 5 New England states, as a matter of fact, offered no support to the War of 1812. They were losing a lot of trade. They were trading with Britain. Now, remember, Maine wasn't a state till 1820, but New England even talked of secession, but never did anything about it. U.S. economy is devastated. This is the 5th of the 12 reasons. Look at flour exports. In 1812, 948,000 tons. In 1815, 60,000 tons were exported. That's a decrease of 94% in flour exports. And here's a company that is using this windmill bread 1812, talking about export, but it's a Michigan company later on. U.S. exports, these flour exports, okay, we're losing all of this. you could buy insurance for your ship and for loss of supplies and trade. Because of the War of 1812, insurance rates on these materials, these marine insurance rates, increased about 75%. This is where insurance started. It started with marine, the supplies that you're exporting, if you happen to lose those, or maybe you lost the entire ship. It was basically the only type of insurance in 1812. Of course, today, you can buy insurance on a wide variety of items. Flour exports, we're going to look at it in barrels. We talked about it in pounds a bit earlier here, a couple of minutes ago. In 1812, 1 million barrels were exported of flour. In 1815, it was 5,000 barrels. Foreign trade in tons, generally speaking, was 1811, 948,000 tons. In 1815, 60,000 tons. Boy, I would think the British could have made an argument about this. We are keeping you from trading. I mean, when they were negotiating that treaty, this would have been a giant argument that we're keeping you and from huge amounts of trade that you've lost. And that was never discussed in the treaty. Item 6, relationships with England. We remained after the War of 1812 pretty much warless throughout the remainder of the 19th century. We became allies in the 20th century, both in World War I, World War II. So quite a major change there. We had a revolution against Britain in the 1770s and 80s. We had a war of 1812 against Britain. Then nothing after 1815, basically. Relations were worried about. By the time we hit the 20th century, we're allies with Great Britain. The conquest of Native Americans occurred in the South and the near West. That means like along the Mississippi River. That was the near West at this time. And of course, the South. We've talked about these battles with Native Americans. Item 8, the Navy War of 1812. The United States saw a need for a much larger Navy as a result of the War of 1812, and we started spending money on a Navy. You can see these are some pretty good sized ships. Look at all the cannon ports along the base of the ship. Look at the number of masts and the number of sails. Item 9, the heroes. We've already talked about Andrew Jackson. This is William Henry Harrison. He was also involved in the War of 1812, winning battles in Indiana, and Zachary Taylor. All three of these men became presidents of the United States. Let's take a little side note here and just take a look at the military and the presidency. We've had 45 different people serve as presidents up to 2023. 31 of them have been in the military. That's 69%. 30 were officers. One was a private. The guy who remained a private during his service was James Buchanan, 15th president just before Abraham Lincoln. 9 of these 31 military presidents were generals. So about 20% were generals. 20% of all presidents were generals. In 2024, there's about 18 million living veterans in the United States. That's about 6% of our total population. but 69% of all presidents are military veterans. Southern states, item number 10, financial losses. 20,000 slaves escaped from the South. That was only about 1.6% of all the slaves that were in the South. And of course, the reason their escape, they immediately went to the British because the British had eliminated slavery. And here they were protected then by the British. In 1812, there were 1.25 million slaves in the United States. In 1865, there were 3.7 million slaves. So the number of slaves had tripled in this 53-year period here between the War of 1812 and the end of the war, the Civil War. Southern states, from another viewpoint, here's a modern day comparison. You know, I always like to make these modern day comparisons. Slavery was a great thing for slaves. Florida government, Ron DeSantis, direct quote, slavery was a good thing. That was a speech he made in Philadelphia at the Marriott Inn on June the 30th of 2023. Hey, they were housed and fed. Britain in North America. As a result of this war, Britain got a much stronger foothold in North America. They needed more troops in Canada. They were very concerned about the United States invading Canada. And the United States, as it moved even further west, I mean, we claimed Oregon Territory to run all the way north to present-day Alaska, which would include all of British Columbia, much of the Yukon Territory, etc. So Canada was concerned about this Western Atlantic area. They were concerned about much of Canada, and they brought in more troops there. Also, here off the coast of the United States is Britain, Britain Island, and that's Bermuda. So the British have gained control and to this day are owners of the island of Bermuda, close to the US. They could maintain shipping there, etc. One of the governors of Bermuda, after he resigned as king, was Edward, I think it was Edward the Eighth, and he married a divorced woman, and the British church didn't approve of it. He served 9 months, I think, as king, and then had to resign. And his brother took over. His brother's daughter was Queen Elizabeth, and he became the governor of Bermuda for a while. The War of 1812, Britain lost lots of single ships. The United States would not engage battles with a fleet of British ships. They couldn't win it. But they easily won these individual battles. And the United States had a lot more time training their sailors than the British did. So US sailors were far better at what they were doing than were the British sailors. Then, remember, trade just disappeared for the United States during this war. During trade, all these private held and privately owned ships that were doing trade had 55,000 sailors on board them. All of a sudden, those 55,000 people aren't working anymore. Trade is blockaded by the British. Those are people extremely well trained who can now fight for the United States. At 12th, the final one, what was the war about? Historians today say the American Revolution in the 1770s was about political independence for the United States. The War of 1812 against the same country, England, from 1812 to 1815, was about economic independence. We now became able to openly trade better and more freely with countries in Europe and around the Mediterranean. Mediterranean really was the world headquarters for great trade. James Madison, how much time we got here? We're going fine. James Madison, after his presidency, document revisions. He started going through all the letters he'd received and copies of letters that he had sent. And he started making changes to them. Oh, I don't like this. Once you got all this stuff behind you, then you go, oh, why did I say that? Sort of thing. So he goes through his lifelong correspondence, his own letters and the letters that he received from other people and documents that were written up. And he did edits. Notice I got that in quote marks. He blacked out some items. We don't know what's there. You can kind of figure out what was being said. He added comments. And then on letters that he'd received from other people, he made changes. And he copied the handwriting of the sender. So this is called something, cheating. Death and burial of Madison. Here's Madison. Remember, he had those blazing blue eyes. There was a painting of him with those eyes. The cause of death was heart failure, and he couldn't swallow the last several days that he was dying. He died at age 85, which is extremely old. Very small percentage of the population was still alive in their 80s back in the mid-18 or early 1800s. He died on the 28th of June of 1836. Here's his burial place. Look, here is a close-up. This is the close-up here. And it says Madison, and it's got his death date and his birth date. And these J.W. Davies and Rich, I have tried looking them up. I think they must have been, they were either the makers of this memorial statue at his gravesite, or they might have been people who paid for it later, but I don't think so. At any rate, this is known as an obelisk. See, they came out of ancient Egypt. It looks like the Washington Monument, which is also an obelisk. See here, the smaller one over here. It's got a little pyramid at the top, and it was due to the greatness of Egypt that we continued using that as memorials. Here's a larger view of the gravesite. His will. There were large sums of money, and I'm going to talk about who they were left to. The American Colonization Society. Now, this was a group that was founded in the early 1800s. We don't want former slaves, freed slaves, living here in the United States. Send them back to Africa. So the American Colonization Society was a bunch of white folks who would have shiploads of blacks, and they'd send them back to Africa. And he left money to this American Colonization Society. A little bit more about them in a minute. Princeton University was his college that he graduated from, where he got his college degree. He left them money. And the University of Virginia, where he was one of the co-founders. Jefferson's really given credit with founding of the University of Virginia, but a tremendous helper to him was Madison. Take a look at this American Colonization Society. the founding of the first African republic. Anyway, Liberia is the country that was founded by the American Colonization Society, and it stands for liberty. So we're sending these freed slaves back to Africa, to a country that means liberty, Liberia. And the capital was named for President James Monroe. It's called Monrovia. So here's a country in Africa. It's been set up by Americans in the American Colonization Society to return freed slaves to Africa. This is the country of Liberia in white here. Here's the Atlantic Ocean. Look, here is a map of Africa. You can see Liberia is right at the curve of that on the Atlantic Ocean there of Africa. Here's a close-up. Here's Monrovia, the capital. Here I've inserted an arrow pointing to the capital. And look at it. Here's Bensonville. I mean, you get cities, Robertsport. You know, these are all English type names. Here's Buchanan. That's Scottish. And there's lots of African origin names then as you get to the interior of the country. The American Colonization Society, okay, they said we need to establish an official language. The official language of Liberia to this day is English. So you can visit Liberia and talk to anybody on the street. American Colonization Society disbanded, yep, 1964. 147 years after its founding, and it was due to the civil rights movement had gained a tremendous amount of power. They said, hey, you're not going to send us back to Africa as we did with many, many freed slaves. They were still proclaiming in 1964 when they disbanded that we need to send all freed slaves and their ancestors back to Africa. So this is Princeton University. This is the main building at Princeton where Madison left money. Here's the University of Virginia. Many of the buildings on this campus, all the original buildings on this campus were designed by Jefferson. Notice he loved pillars and arches too. We don't see arches here, but this is one of the main buildings at the University of Virginia. He also left money to his wife. Here's on the left as a young woman, and on the right as an elderly woman. Left her $30,000 in his will of 1836. That's about $750,000 today. And you can notice here, we've talked about it. She was taller than he was. He was 5'4". She was 5'7". This money was not enough to maintain her. I mean, she moved to Washington, D.C. It was a high buck area. She had financial problems as a result. Slavery. Let's talk about James Madison and slavery. Madison owned a plantation. It had a slave population. At his peak, he owned about 100 slaves. When he died, he owned a total of 36. The reason for the reduction was he was having financial difficulties after he left the presidency, and he was selling off slaves in order to maintain his lifestyle. He never freed a slave during his lifetime, and he never freed a slave in his will. Let's talk about 10 major attitudes Madison had about slavery. He felt it was creating lots of instability within the American society. Tensions between the North, which were free states, and the South, tensions between whites and slaves all throughout the South. So difficulties. Soldiers who volunteered during the American Revolution got a slave. Madison countered with slaves who volunteered are to be freed at the war's end. Well, there weren't many volunteering on the side of the United States, many black slaves who they were running to the British. Madison proposed that the slave trade should end. This is during the Constitutional Convention now. This is back in 1787. He's saying, let's end the slave trade. Well, they never put that in the Constitution, that you couldn't bring slaves from Africa to the United States anymore. But it did end in 1808, 21 years later. No more slaves can come into the United States. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, well, great, see, we were starting to end slavery. And unfortunately, this was not a moral decision. It was actually something that benefited slave owners. If you're not bringing slaves into the United States from Africa, then the only way to get more slaves is to buy them from other slave owners. So breeding of slaves and then selling them, if you had excessive slaves, really benefited slave owners already in the U.S. Southern support was needed. Madison supported counting each slave as 3/5 of a white person. That gave a lot more representation to the South in the United States, added to the number of congressmen that the South had because you could count a slave as 3/5 of a person. Slaves, of course, couldn't vote. Madison also proclaimed that slavery should be allowed in Western territories. Look at all this orange, huge Western territories. The argument was, should slavery be allowed there, or should these be free areas? These northern states were saying, this has got to be free areas with no slavery. All these southern states here were saying, no, you got to allow slavery in those areas. And Madison thought that slavery should be allowed in those Western territories. Madison stated that the northern states were republics, and that's what's required in the Constitution. But he said, take a look at the South. It's really an aristocracy. It's the rule of a few. The huge plantation owners not only rule over slaves, but even over the poor white folks. And look at geographically here. Look at the size of the slave states in red versus the size of the free states in blue. Southern white population in 1820 was 4.4 million. The slave population was 1.8 million. That's about 30% of the Southern population was slaves. Madison never had his slaves physically beaten. He had stated that, number one, it's cruel, and number two, it could lead to revolts. Many slave owners, including presidents who owned slaves, did have their slaves beaten. Madison lived in Washington, D.C. Here, 1801 to 1809, he was Secretary of State under Jefferson, and then 1809 to 1817, when he was president himself, total of 16 years. He had slaves with him, including slaves working in the White House that he owned. And he hired out many of his slaves while he was in Washington, D.C., and not able to run his plantation on his own. Here's a book. Equal pay law was passed in 1963 for all people. At any rate, here's a book, Black History of the White House by Clarence Lucene. And it's all about Black people working in the White House, mostly as slaves, although They were not getting paid as much as white people. One of the black workers at the White House complained to President Ronald Reagan, who saw to it that the salaries were then equalized for blacks and whites working at the White House. Donald Trump, when he was president, stopped corporations from having to report to the US government what their pay scales were. Here's what women make, here's what men make, here's what blacks make. You know, the whole thing was, we want to get this equalized. Trump said, we're going to stop corporations from having to report those differences in salary based on race and gender. The work schedule for Madison's slaves was dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. 100 slaves at his maximum, 36 when he died, never freed a slave. Dolley Madison inherited slaves. She had to sell a lot of them to pay off debts and maintain her lifestyle. She gave a few to her son. Here's James Madison, quote, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time, a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man." This is a statement against slavery, but also proof that Madison did not practice what he preached. Let's take a look at the rankings of Madison. Political scientists and historians do rankings. They've been done irregularly every 3 to 7 years, roughly. Today they're done by Siena College by 4 historians. Political scientists rank most recently Madison as the 12th greatest president of the 45 presidents that we've had. Historians have ranked him 8th among 45 presidents. Memorials to Madison. This is the James Madison Building, the Library of Congress. I've been to Washington, D.C. many times. I've done a lot of research in this building. This is a relatively new building, as you can see, just looking at it. The Jefferson Building is the oldest building in the Library of Congress. Here's the interior of this Madison Building. This is a research area. They have very large tables, half a dozen people, up to 10 people, depending on the size of the table. Lots of librarian help. Sometimes you have to wear gloves, depending on what you're looking at there. Here's Madison's home, Montpelier, and you can tour that today. This is Madison, Wisconsin. There's several counties. There are cities, towns named for Madison, but most famously is Madison, Wisconsin. And that is the end. We have a few more minutes, and I could tell you, I could do a mini lecture here on 10 worst blunders in American history by presidents, and then we'll get to questions. 10 worst blunders. Madison's number 6. Let's take a look at these. Clinton was ranked number 10. This is the University of Louisville at Kentucky that did these rankings. The Monica Lewinsky sexual affair. Many presidents have had these. I'm guessing it's a majority. Republicans kept this one alive in the 1990s. Had very negative effects on the Clinton administration. Ronald Reagan, the Iran-Contra affair, he was selling arms to Iran and then using the money to fight a war in Nicaragua, which was undeclared, and he didn't think he could get money out of Congress or approval from Congress to do it. Further, drug dealing occurred. This is the OLLI North controversy. Drugs were being brought into the United States. The charges are Reagan approved of this, had the military working on it with Oliver North of the Marine Corps, and then they would sell these drugs internally in the US, and money would be diverted to the war in Nicaragua. John F. Kennedy, Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy provided no air support that caused the failure of this invasion. Why it was done is being gigantically debated, why he didn't do air support there. Maybe he was worried about a gigantic war, this becoming something other than what, and it was a communist country. What if Russia gets involved, etc. Number 7, Thomas Jefferson, the Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited trade with Europe, and it was during the Napoleonic Wars, and it just ruined the economy of the United States. Here's Madison. War of 1812 is considered his big mistake. He could have negotiated peace without a war. Could have gotten some of the items that the war was involved with taken care of through State Department negotiations, etc. Richard Nixon, the Watergate burglary, is ranked number 5 by the University of Louisville. Democratic Party office burglaries, there were a total of 3 of them. They were done with Nixon's direction. Gain election strategies from what are the Democrats going to do in this election against me. Then he covered up the scandal. Number 4 is Woodrow Wilson and the treaty that ended World War I. He went to Paris to negotiate this treaty. He took no Republicans with him, so they didn't like it. Consequently, when the Treaty of Versailles, which is a suburb outside of Paris, when the Treaty of Versailles was presented to the Senate for approval, Republicans didn't like it. The United States never agreed to the Treaty of Versailles, never had to honor it as a result. Here's William Borah on your left, Republican leader in the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. in the middle, and Reed Smoot on your right. And they led the fight to have no approval, no confirmation of the treaty that ended World War II. Lyndon Johnson's ranked number 3 of the Vietnam War. He continued adding troops, materials, money. Protests were gigantic all across the United States. I was in Kansas City at the time. I was a student there, and I went to an anti-war demonstration. There were 5 people at it. By the time I left, there were thousands of people at the anti-war demonstrations in Kansas City. This is Andrew Johnson. He opposed black rights after the Civil War. He didn't want any reconstruction. He said, okay, black people are free, but they have no rights, including the right to get married. So his opposition to freed slaves and what they deserved or what they should have ranks him number 2 in the 10 worst presidential blunders. And number 1 is James Buchanan, who did nothing when Southern states started to secede from the Union. And it was 5 months before Lincoln took office. Lots of time that something could have been done. Buchanan said, that's a problem for the next group of guys. Also, if you like James Buchanan, here's a scotch that's got his name on it, James Buchanan and Company. It's a Scottish whiskey. and joy. And that's the end of the lectures. I would like to say that I am not teaching this summer. It's a long time until fall quarter starts. It's 4 months. I'm going to be working on some lectures. Hey, I'm thinking I've got lectures on Lincoln that last 2 quarters. I've expanded them. I need to make more slides. I'm not sure. I could do Monroe next for fall quarter. I might do Lincoln and it would last all 3 quarters. And there's just so much stuff about Lincoln we never hear about. When you make somebody into a hero, it's pretty interesting. I would talk about all of the Lincoln heroics, many of which are true, but also a lot of stuff that we miss as a result. So anyway, do we have any questions? No.
Yeah, at the moment, no questions, just a correction from earlier, right near the beginning. You were talking about Trump looking for those 11,000 votes, and you were saying Alabama, and it's really Georgia.
Yeah, that's right.
Slip of
Sorry.
the tongue, I'm sure, but
No, I even had the wrong map of
ah,
the state on
okay,
that slide. Yeah, it wasn't Alabama. It was,
okay. So that was something that was pointed out.
yep.
Um,
Thank
a
you.
couple things, a couple other things. Let's thank Grayson, our Simmons, who's been providing our behind the scenes tech help from OLLI. He's been great and super reliable. And along with his partner, James, I think, wasn't it, who helped?
Paul McClagan.
Paul
Yeah.
McClagan. Why I think it's James, it's just because I haven't had enough coffee this month, basically. But yes, both of you guys have provided great backing up assistance and help, and really appreciate that. Um, Otherwise, anything else you want to say, JB, before we?
Uh, no, there's, lots of presidential material, I guess. This could go
Mhm.
on forever. I'm getting old.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't remember ever making mistakes, and I've had 2 of them in these series of lectures. So I think I'm thinking modern. All this trouble is with Alabama recently has gotten me to. Anyway, it's good. Correct it. That's all I can say is keep it corrected. So
yeah. See, I can't remember a name from 2 weeks ago, so it's
yeah. Well, the 2 weeks is pretty good. I walked from the kitchen to the utility room and can't remember what I was doing in there.
and that's right. I wanted to also thank you for the behind the scenes tour that we got today of your
Oh,
office.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. A view from the other side.
Okay, well, we are just hitting 2 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for making this a great session. We hope that you will be joining us again in the fall, whether it be Monroe or Lincoln. It will be interesting. And just thanks to everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Have a good summer and hope to see you at some of our other history programming.
Bye.
Thanks.